Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the last session of Samudramanthan. I've been told that we must stop at the time which is indicated in the program, so I'll strive towards that. This session addresses cooperative mechanisms in the Bay of Bengal. And the Bay of Bengal, as Admiral Asthana mentioned in the morning, at 2.2 million square kilometers is not a bay. It is in fact a sea, the 11th largest body of water on earth, and it is 5 times larger than the Black Sea and almost marginally smaller than the Mediterranean Sea. So therefore what we are discussing today is not a small regional construct. It is indeed actually a large one, comparable to other well-known structures such as the Black Sea Economic Cooperation, the Three Seas Initiative, and several of the ASEAN-led maritime forums. I wish to offer only 2 broad points for consideration of the panel. The first is that the Bay of Bengal is blessed in that, firstly, we have it is one of the large seas that has a very limited number of stakeholders, and geographically, to be precise, there are only 5. That is Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. And therefore, there is a lot of scope to develop consensus and move together to make this cooperation fruitful. And if we see that India, Myanmar, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Thailand, we are already such good friends. So I don't see any reason why the Bay of Bengal region should not be a well-knit region and an exemplar of regional cooperation. The second point is that when we discuss cooperative mechanisms in the Bay of Bengal, there is a need to look beyond the Bay of Bengal. And Indonesia comes to my mind immediately, simply because the southeastern edge or the corner of the Bay of Bengal is defined by Pulau Breu, which is an island in the Aceh province of Indonesia. So Indonesia naturally is actually a stakeholder in the Bay of Bengal. Also, we must see that organizations such as IORA and other organizations, IORA, whose area encompasses the Bay of Bengal within itself, how should it approach Bay of Bengal? Should it address Bay of Bengal issues as a part of its wider agenda, or should it focus or facilitate focus on the Bay of Bengal as a specific region of considerable significance? So these are 2 issues, and I think we'll have a fruitful discussions during this panel. We are joined by very eminent panelists here. The first speaker for this session is Mr. Prasanth Chandran. Mr. Chandran is an officer of the Indian Economics Service. He joined IES in the 2007 batch. He holds a master's degree in economics and has had a diverse and accomplished career across various government departments and as also in the academia. He has been an assistant professor of economics at the University College Trivandrum and also has worked in Department of Economic Affairs, the Planning Commission, the Ministry of Shipping, the Ministry of External Affairs, and Department of Agriculture and Farmers Welfare. And presently, he is in the Secretariat, BIMSTEC Secretariat in Dhaka as Director Security. So, without much ado, I invite Mr. Prasanth Chandran to deliver his presentation.
So this, after the signing of MOU during the last summit, we have received a framework of cooperation draft 1 from IORA Secretariat, which we have circulated among our member states for their comments or inputs. So it is still at the draft level only. Nothing much has happened ever since. We have received inputs from 1 or 2 countries, and I am not going into their comments now. Whatever I am going to convey here is my personal views and nothing pertains to my office. So the presentation structure should be the areas of cooperation identified in the MOU and potential activities which can be undertaken. And third one, whether we should have the capacity to take it forward. These are the areas of cooperation. Broadly, BIMSTEC is having around 15 selected areas of identified areas of cooperation under 7 broad themes. And this covers almost every sector except agriculture, and the security sector it covers partially. Only maritime security aspect is being covered here. So I think the broad areas of how to take this forward, I have identified 2-3 areas. The first one is legal and institutional harmonization. Regarding legal aspect, legal framework, BIMSTEC is having a very rich background in the sense that we have ratified one convention on terrorism and transnational crimes. The second one on mutual assistance on legal matters, which is pending for ratification from only one country, and the 6 other nations have already ratified it. Third one is Convention on Human Trafficking, which has been finalized and pending for approval from the first level of competent authority. We are having a rich or robust institutional structure as well. We have a dialogue forum both at the core level as well as at the sectoral level, including the ministers' forum and the national security chiefs. So the first aspect for a regional cooperation framework requires legal and institutional harmonization. So we have already developed several legal and institutional mechanisms which can be shared and which can be aligned or scaled up through this partnership. So we need not cause any duplication in that aspect. Second is the practical mechanism. BIMSTEC is having some evolving operational framework. The first one is, of course, the disaster management exercise, including tabletop exercise. 4 rounds have already been completed, and the first ever maritime security exercise will be held later part of this year. So all these practical or operational mechanisms, surely they will contribute to enhancing interoperability, strengthen our preparedness, and facilitate standardization of operational procedure. Also, the regular exchange and training programs also help to build professional or trust among our professionals. Third aspect is information and information sharing and early warning. We have one center of excellence on weather and climate. They are issuing weekly forecast regarding maritime domain awareness. One white shipping agreement is being a concept note is being in the drafting stage. During the last summit held in 2005 in Thailand, our Honourable Prime Minister has announced certain initiatives on space cooperation also, including assisting the other member countries in developing nanosatellites, establishing or setting up one Earth station in any other BIMSTEC member states, and so on. BIMSTEC is also working on developing digital platforms, especially on 2 aspects: human trafficking as well as drug trafficking. Drug trafficking, that concept note is that will be set up by India, and the human trafficking, it will be set up with the assistance from UNODC. So once these kind of platforms are operational, they can be eventually expanded and linked with the similar initiatives under IORA framework. In institutional cooperation, I have covered this topic already. Secretariat to Secretariat cooperation is very much essential in the sense that BIMSTEC Secretariat is a small office, from top to bottom around 30 people, and we don't have any experts in the Secretariat. We actually heavily depend on our expert groups, which meet annually or periodically. But at the same time, we are in the process of setting up centers of excellence. Centers of excellence, we have already set up 2. One is BCWC, BIMSTEC for Weather and Climate, and the second one is BIMSTEC Energy Center. But we have a plan to set up, especially around 10 centers are at the conceptual level now. Mainly, we got a proposal from Thailand, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and India. Then another one is academic and think tank collaboration. Then both our organizations, BIMSTEC as well as IORA, we are in touch with several other international organizations as well, including UNDRR and even IFCI, they are in touch. The question is whether we are having the institutional capability to take this cooperation forward. BIMSTEC is already having, we are having a diverse group of expert groups on various themes. and sectoral mechanisms. We have centers of excellence and established exercise and training platform. Now, coming to the centers of excellence, ultimately BIMSTEC has to depend on centers of excellence. Unfortunately, only 2 are operational now. I can say that BIMSTEC is on the cusp of a big jump in terms of the centers of excellence is concerned, in the sense that so far we depend on, as per the ROP of the centers, the funding mechanism, that is the main headache. So the funding should be equally shared by all member states, and that will not be going to happen, frankly. So that prevented us from setting up more and more centers of excellence. But during the last summit, we have taken a decision in the sense that now whichever the country which is proposing to set up a center of excellence, they would bear all expenses, including administrative expenses. They won't depend on funding from any other member states. So accordingly, that has been a big relief for us. India now has proposed different centers of excellence, one on BIMSTEC Center of Excellence on disaster management, that is not at operational. Then another one is on sustainable maritime transport cooperation, agriculture, and traditional medicine. Similarly, Sri Lanka is in the process of one technology transfer facility and center of excellence, another center of excellence on culture that is being proposed by Bhutan. So the difference now is that the center of excellence, if any country is willing to set up a center of excellence, they need not wait for funding from any other country. If you are willing to set up one, you can set up and you can run it. Administrative control will be with that host country. And the center would be run by an advisory council. Advisory council will be doing all technical substantive work. So they need not be unnecessarily involved in administrative headaches. They can go ahead with their technical work. So that is the revised mechanism. So we think that this will take us forward a great. So this is the new framework of centers of excellence, and once these centers of excellence are operational, they will take up all the technical work, not the Secretariat. For example, if we want to have an MOU with any organization, international agency, like suppose ISA, they can have an MOU with the the center of excellence pertaining to that area. For example, BIMSTEC Energy Center. Similarly, if CDRI wants, then it will be dealt with the concerned agency from our side. So the lacuna or shortfall we are facing in the Secretariat, that will be addressed. The conclusion is there is a strong potential for cooperation. We need to connect and operationalize existing regional mechanism. We are in the process of moving from dialogue to, actually BIMSTEC so far has been on dialogue phase only. Only operational mechanism was BIMSTEC disaster management exercise. Fortunately, another one is coming up, that is our BIMSTEC maritime security exercise, the first ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chandran, Mr. Chandran, for your talk. Actually, it brings out many areas which are not known to the public, and actually we are enlightened on how the BIMSTEC actually works at the Secretariat level. What are the plans right now for future, and what has actually happened till now. Thank you very much. We'll be taking the question and answers during the Q&A session. Our second speaker, I would like to invite Dr. Pooja Bhatt. Dr. Pooja Bhatt is an associate professor at the Jindal School of International Affairs, OP Jindal Global University, Sonipat, and where she teaches international relations and security studies. Earlier, she has had a strong academic background, and that she has worked with the Ministry of External Affairs also. Her areas of research interest are maritime security and international relations. She's got a long profile. I won't read all that. Maybe she can search her up, look her up on LinkedIn. But without much ado, again, I invite Dr. Pooja Bhatt to deliver her talk.
Thank you, Chair, for the free promotion. I am a last-minute admin, so I would take all the last-minute promotion that I can get here. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, organizers, for having me for this talk. And I've been given a topic, and I'm very happy to speak on the topic as BIMSTEC as the norm setter. As someone who has been researching and teaching forward now 1.5 decades on Asian security architectures as well as maritime security, I'm very, very happy to talk on this topic and why in this world we should be considering BIMSTEC as a norm setter in a world where now more and more countries are withdrawing themselves out of international organizations, and we are seeing left, right, and center these organizations are failing. Why should we have a faith in something like BIMSTEC, which is an institution by 7 countries which are themselves very developing in economic stage, and they have a lot of their own problems going on. An institution brought by them, So these are the questions anyone would ask to start with. And as I am a very optimist about organization and institutions, I would have 3 major points to say that why BIMSTEC I would consider as a norm setter for the region, Bay of Bengal. What can it bring about and how it can bring about. And very clearly, I want to just put across these ideas for you, and you can always come back to me with all your shooting guns. Data points, I think, was very clear since morning. I'm sure you must have all known why Bay of Bengal is important. It connects South Asia to Southeast Asia. It has 6 trillion US dollar trade passing through the Bay of Bengal, especially energy supplies through China, Japan, and India and South Korea. This is also a cyclone-prone region. Most importantly, this is a home to 1/5 of humanity, and that is the crux of the point. That, and as Chair also mentioned, it's as good as a sea. It's not just a bay. So the kind of geographical importance, humanitarian importance keeps for us. I think it's worth talking about how do we govern it. So first of all, why BIMSTEC? And I believe in the power of institutions. What the idea of institution is to develop, promote, and embed some standards of behavior and norms in the member states to internalize them and actually treat them as legitimate obligations. In that regard, I think BIMSTEC in the last 3 decades or so has done a lot of work. You have had 15 areas, which I think previous scholars have spoken about, and now that those 15 areas have been translated into 7 priority areas: trade, investment, environment, climate change, security, connectivity, science, technology, people to people, agriculture, and all these topics or areas are actually aligned with the regional needs and aspirations, and they're just not external juxtaposition. We have an organization which already is working on these areas. Second, the idea of norm setting is very, very inherent in BIMSTEC. So it's not just about bringing some new ideas and bringing some cooperation on ideas, but it also institutions should also have the capability and capacity to execute those policies. And I think with the present developments that we saw, that BIMSTEC established an energy center at Bangalore. There's a BIMSTEC development fund which was organized, BIMBRIN scholarship that was organized for research and development. I think goes on to demonstrate that why it's just not a norm setting institution, but also an institution that can bring that capability capacities. And lastly, BIMSTEC itself is a institution with legal provisions. It has its own charter, which gave its institutional procedures for decision making and dispute resolution. So I think we have something already present with us, and we don't need to go on looking for other organization platform when we see look at regional cooperation. Second part of my thinking process would be what, despite, and previous speaker, Secretary BIMSTEC also said that there are some structural and financial limitations with the institution. How do you translate these ideas, these intents to actions? And again, BIMSTEC comes into picture in terms of building a robust and I hope so resource secretariat, which I think is a work in progress. But more importantly, it has to bring in, and that is very reassuring when I heard him when he said that there are certain groups that have worked on the present issues. Apart from that, I would suggest that in addition to those working groups, there have to be certain track 1.5, track 2 conversation. It should be facilitated by think tanks and academia, because they just not generate ideas, but they also provide cross-national consensus on issues of importance of people, which is most important. Second reason what BIMSTEC can bring is and that is my input in this, is that we should build in private sectors in terms of financial and governance, involvement in these institutions. And why I would say is that because most of the priority areas that have been recognized by BIMSTEC in 7 priority areas are largely spearheaded by private sectors, and these private sectors regularly interact with government mechanisms. So they are very well versed with the people in terms of negotiations and clear cut. So therefore, if you involve those private sectors in everyday communication, they not only bring their expectation and communication, which is very necessary in terms of building some solid ideas, but also the necessary fundings which is required for executing such huge level programs that BIMSTEC wants to carry on. In this regard, otherwise, if not private sector, other idea that I might want to suggest here is to bringing in government-backed investment agencies such as JICA, which is Japan International Cooperation Agency, and others, which can bring in necessary investment which are necessary for these projects. And lastly, again my idea, and I'm very happy to hear from DG NMF when he said about how do we bring those ideas and who will create the data and who will. I think one suggestion here would be from my side is creation of Blue Knowledge Bridge propelled by BIMSTEC, and all the policy making. And why would I suggest is because policy making requires data, it requires research, it requires analysis constantly, and all this requires funding. And every conversation, I think DG NMF would agree, over the years and decades that he has been listening for far more than me, I think he knows best that we have not been doing regular data analysis. And we need an institution that can promote that. And when we have an institution, I think we should very well use it. Given the fact, because blue economy remains one of the pillar of BIMSTEC, and the issues such as sustainable fisheries, IUU fishing governance, marine spatial planning, blue financing models, everything can be covered in that research and analysis or under Blue Knowledge Bridge. And this also helps in avoiding duplication of resources and also leverage the present structures to bolster the blue economy knowledge platform. It requires technical underpinnings, it requires targeted funding for research, it also requires shared vision for maritime prosperity and use. I think BIMSTEC has everything, all they need is little more funding for all this. Lastly, how can BIMSTEC specifically work in the area of maritime security while developing norms, and how does it bring about these ideas into genuinely binding operational maritime security norms? So we have heard about maritime security being one of the areas. We have, joint exercises and disaster response systems can be one of the areas where a lot of cooperation can still come through. We have some capacities here, not yet met the entire of it. Second is the connectivity. BIMSTEC already has master plan for transport connectivity, and it is also its substantial normative achievement. And some scholars would argue that it is direct counter narrative to China's BRI. Why can't BIMSTEC leverage on that in developing genuine norm setting in terms of connectivity, which is not predicted? Third is blue economy. As I mentioned, blue economy requires research and analysis in terms of which areas require more dedicated funding and research. I think that is one other area where BIMSTEC can bring upon its expertise through working groups. And lastly, climate change, and I think Dr. Yudhan, very eloquently spoke about why climate research is important. And Bay of Bengal climate resilience and adaptation governance is something we should be looking at in terms of that kind of security and norm building. So overall, we have an institution. What it requires some kind of funding, some kind of direction in terms of constant. It should not be like one conference like this happens and then we forget about the next conference, which we all know happens. And I think that kind of constant working is required, which only come from a dedicated team. I'm sure a people of 30, group of 30 people, sitting in BIMSTEC Dhaka, might have a lot more other things to do than to just do dedicated research, and we need scholars, and there are scholars. So bottom line is, BIMSTEC has its role cut out both normatively and as a policy executor, but it needs to move from declaration to delivery or cede the governance space to others. And with that, I will close my talk.
Now I invite Dr. Sayan Haldar, our third speaker in the panel. Dr. Haldar is an associate fellow with the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation. His work is focused on maritime studies, and his areas of research interest are questions on geopolitics, maritime security, and regionalism in the Indian Ocean, and interestingly, the Arctic. Over to you, Dr. Haldar.
Thank you, Chair, and let me just begin by thanking NMF, Professor Pathak, Professor Shengupta for this opportunity. I too was given a topic to speak on at this conference, which is lessons from ASEAN-led cooperation for the wider Bay of Bengal region. And I would actually like to use the Indo-Pacific as the starting point for my presentation, because it's also a very interesting development that we are witnessing currently as is underway, because in the earlier decade of this century, Shinzo Abe reminded us that Indo-Pacific is a new construct of the confluence of the two seas. But discussions such as this also remind us that the Indo-Pacific is also undergoing a sense of churn. The Indo-Pacific is in the middle of churn, where the constituent pockets of the Indo-Pacific, for example, Southeast Asia or Bay of Bengal, are currently being looked at by each other to provide templates of how a particular region can sort of advance in terms of fostering cooperation. So I think that would be the first point. The overarching sort of lesson that I draw from ASEAN-led cooperation for the Bay of Bengal region is on the idea of regional consciousness, and I think it's very important to be discussing this concept of regional consciousness within frameworks such as ASEAN or the Bay of Bengal region amidst practitioners as well, because I think much of these discourses sort of tend to preface the operational aspect of how we take cooperation forward. So if you look at ASEAN, for example, it is built on this identity or regional consciousness of Southeast Asia. Now, Southeast Asia has had a historical or a civilizational sort of preface based on which the sense of identity has brought this institution together, and the operational elements are moving ahead in terms of the regional consciousness of Southeast Asia. Now, and similarly, the interests and challenges articulated by ASEAN, for example, are based on this aspect of regional consciousness, which is missing in the case of Bay of Bengal. So, and not just the Bay of Bengal, but I would say that this is a wider Indian Ocean problem. This is a challenge for the wider Indian Ocean littoral space. So, for example, if you look at countries like Indonesia, for example, they define themselves in Southeast Asian terms. When we think of countries like Thailand, the sort of geography in which we tend to embed them from the word go is Southeast Asia. But interestingly, these are also countries which are Indian Ocean countries, but they don't define themselves as Indian Ocean. I would say to a large extent this problem is there in India as well. While previously we used to call ourselves a South Asian country, now the Indo-Pacific is in vogue, and therefore I think our identity is defined in terms of the Indo-Pacific. But interestingly, if you look at our security challenges and the role geography plays, it is the Indian Ocean or the Bay of Bengal to a large extent which should ideally be sort of the framework through which we define ourselves. So I think there is this need to invoke political or even cultural sort of elements which sort of give way to this Bay of Bengal identity. And this, I think, is the first sort of lesson from ASEAN that we need to take forward when we are talking about how cooperation in the Bay of Bengal in particular can sort of move forward. The second, I would say, is that another interesting sort of similarity between Southeast Asia and Bay of Bengal in the Indo-Pacific context is that both of them are often defined as buffer zones between the Indian and the Pacific Ocean. So Southeast Asia and the Bay of Bengal are both sort of spaces where the Indian and the Pacific Oceans meet, and therefore we tend to sort of define them as an interface as such. I think we need to sort of not view the Bay of Bengal as a buffer zone, much like ASEAN, where they have sort of articulated a position for themselves and positioned themselves in a certain way within the Indo-Pacific. So similarly, I think it is very imperative for us to not view or to avoid viewing the Bay of Bengal region as a buffer zone as such, but to treat it as a strategic theater or a strategic geography in its own right. I think I'm already much aligned with the previous two presentations in terms of BIMSTEC, institutional cooperation, and in many ways I think BIMSTEC, given that we have a formal institutional framework which guides cooperation in the Bay of Bengal region, it is imperative for us to strengthen mechanisms by way of which BIMSTEC can continue to emerge as a catalyst in many ways, I would say, to inject momentum in fostering Bay of Bengal cooperation. And if you look at how BIMSTEC is actually moving forward in terms of norm dissemination, for example, BIMSTEC constituency is actually very forward-looking, because if we look at the other institutional mechanisms in the Indian Ocean or the Indo-Pacific, we will see that they are grounded in a very maritime character. But that's not the case with BIMSTEC. We also have landlocked countries as constituent members of the BIMSTEC, for example, and that is very forward-looking, because in today's era of seaborne globalization, it's not just the littoral countries or the island countries who are affected by the different churnings that we see in the oceans, but also countries like Nepal. Given that connectivity is largely multimodal in character, these countries also tend to depend a lot on oceans in order to sort of move ahead in their trade or economic engagement. So I think there is a lesson for others also to take from BIMSTEC, interestingly, in that aspect. In terms of maritime security cooperation, I think that's a bit of a slippery slope when it comes to the Indian Ocean region, because we see a marked difference in the way other countries approach questions of security as opposed to India, for example. So, when there is this lack of sort of coherence in the way in which various countries perceive security challenges, or the way in which they define what their security interests are, I think the way to go ahead would be to sort of harp on the common minimum agenda. And there is a sizable focus or potential for sizable focus on a common minimum agenda in the Bay of Bengal region. If you look at what the challenges are, it's not the challenge posed by a particular country the way, for example, India would, for example, define it. But if you look at non-traditional areas of security, that's really where I think maritime security cooperation can be heralded by sort of not just BIMSTEC, but also in the wider Bay of Bengal region. Rising sea levels, for example, Bay of Bengal is an extremely cyclone-prone region, for example. So I think these are the elements that need to be sort of focused on when we are looking at a common minimum agenda in terms of maritime security. And interestingly, a lesson from ASEAN as well. If you look at the constituency of ASEAN, it's not like all Southeast Asian countries agree on the China question, for example. Yet there is a very degree of response that they have towards China, and institutionally also there is a separate charter of cooperation that they are advancing in terms of taking their cooperation forward. In terms of how we are able to advance cooperation, I would say a forward-looking agenda is important, and I think much of it has already been discussed in detail. But just to name a few, I think maritime domain awareness, undersea critical infrastructure, these are certainly going to be very important pivots around which a wider maritime security architecture can be shaped in the Bay of Bengal region. The need to infuse technology, so I think therefore a futuristic or a forward-looking agenda is essential. And countries such as India, Singapore, I think these are very important pivots in maritime domain awareness architecture in the broader Indo-Pacific, and certainly have a tremendous scope of opportunity to work in the Bay of Bengal as well. The Pacific Islands, for example, why can't we foster a wider network of maritime domain awareness cooperation, which also sort of aids efforts in the Bay of Bengal region. Another point that I would like to make here is that much like how ASEAN has been engaging with several countries to advance cooperation in Southeast Asia, what is the role of non-resident actors in the Bay of Bengal region? Two countries which come to my mind are Japan and Australia. These are two countries which have been present in the Bay of Bengal region, which have been operationally present in terms of not just Malabar but also Quad, for example. If you engage with literature on how Australia defines maritime security interests, there is this sense of focus on Northeast Indian Ocean. Now, what is Northeast Indian Ocean? There is much overlap that we see between Northeast Indian Ocean construct and the Bay of Bengal. So I think alignments and convergences of that sort need to be identified and cooperation built forward. Institutional cooperation, we had a presentation on IORA BIMSTEC cooperation, but also Colombo Security Conclave. I think the CSC is also at the cusp of taking off as a major maritime security framework in the Indian Ocean, and also has constituent countries from the Bay of Bengal as well. And finally, let me just conclude by talking about the trappings that we can also learn from ASEAN. When we talk about the Indo-Pacific, for example, I think one of the central pillars which we engaged much with initially was this concept of ASEAN centrality. What was the Indo-Pacific without ASEAN centrality? But it has largely remained marginal in operational terms. It has been more sort of, it has been a strategic vocabulary for sure, but what is the operational element of ASEAN centrality? That I think is one trapping which the Bay of Bengal needs to sort of be cautious about and ensure that the Bay of Bengal or as I said earlier, it should not be a buffer zone as such, but a strategic theatre of its own right. So I think it's very important to be effective operationally rather than just being effective discursively. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now invite the last speaker of the session, Ms. Muskan Rai, who is a research fellow at the NMF, and incidentally, she is one of the NMF team members who have been very instrumental in putting this conference together. And I'm glad that she's positioned herself in the last of the session as the last speaker. Ms. Muskan Rai, she specializes in multilateral maritime cooperation mechanisms in the Indian Ocean region with focus on frameworks such as IORA and BIMSTEC. She holds a master's degree in international relations, security and strategy from the Jindal School of International Affairs. And she has authored and co-authored several policy-oriented articles on issues such as India's upcoming chairmanship or the current ongoing chairmanship of IORA, and also strengthening institutional linkages in the Bay of Bengal. Ms. Muskan Rai, please deliver your presentation.
Thank you so much, sir, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Am I audible now? Better? No. To the last. Good evening, everyone. I'm Muskan Rai, and I have the slightly daunting task of being the last speaker of the day, which means you've already sat through a full day of hopefully fascinating, substantive discussion on BIMSTEC, the Bay of Bengal region, the multilateral constructs, non-traditional security challenges. A lot of ground has been covered. So, in my 15 minutes, which will be spent in stepping back slightly and asking a question that I believe sits underneath many of today's conversations. All these frameworks, these institutions, these formal mechanisms we've been discussing, what actually holds them together? What keeps the conversation going when the formal channels slow down? Or when political relations between two countries get complicated, or when a government changes and suddenly bilateral engagement needs to be rebuilt from scratch. My argument is that the answer, a big part of it anyway, is track 1.5 and track 2 platforms. And I mean, look around this room. Researchers, government officials, serving officials, academics, all in a conversation. This seminar, Samudramanthan itself, is pretty much textbook track 1.5 platform. So in a sense, you're already living inside my research. I'm going to repeat a few numbers again that have been repeated throughout the day. The Bay of Bengal region is home to 22% of the world's population, combined GDP of around 5.2 trillion US dollars, and a quarter of all the world's traded goods pass through the Bay of Bengal every year. I'd like to reiterate my colleagues in saying that this is not a peripheral maritime space. This is one of the most strategically and economically significant geographies on the planet. And yet, its governance coordination mechanisms have not kept pace with its strategic importance. India released the policy of Mahasagar, which stands for Mutual and Holistic Advancement for Security and Growth Across Regions, only in March 2025. Extra-regional powers are deepening their presence and influence. The demands on this region are growing, but the architecture to manage those demands are still catching up. So, let's name the problem. It's not that Bay of Bengal lacks institutions. It has the BIMSTEC, Indian Ocean Gym Association, the Colombo Security Conclave, the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, various bilateral frameworks. There's actually quite a lot going on. The problem is that these institutions often operate in parallel rather than in concert. Mandates overlap, political sensitivities between member states slow things down. Capacities vary hugely across littoral state. And even when there is political will, implementation is painfully slow. My favorite example of that last point, BIMSTEC was founded in 1997. Its charter the foundational legal document for the organization, only entered into force in May 2024, 27 years. That's not a gap between ambition and execution. That is a chasm. So the challenge here is not institutional absence. It is coordination despite institutional density. And that is where informal mechanisms come in. I would like to lay out the framework I've been working with, because I want to be precise about what I mean by track 1.5 and track 2. Track 1 is your standard official diplomacy, governments talk to government, or formal treaties, summit. It has real political authority behind it. But it is also constrained by sovereignty, by consensus requirements, by the pace of political processes. Track 2 is at the other end. Academics, researchers, veterans, civil society. It is exploratory, it is flexible, it generates ideas and builds norm over time based on collaborative reasoning. Unfortunately, its connection to actual policy decision is indirect and slow. Track 1.5 sits in the middle, serving officials, policymakers, experts in the domain, interacting in semi-formal settings, close enough to power to influence it, but informal enough that people can actually say what they think. And in practice, these three do not operate in neat separate silos. They bleed into each other constantly, and that is the aim. Track diplomacy is not a new idea. It goes back to the Cold War, specifically to the Pugwash conferences in the 1950s and 60s, where American and Soviet scientists kept talking to each other at exactly the moment when official government contact was politically impossible. The logic was, if the governments can't talk, at least let the experts. After the Cold War, these mechanisms expanded significantly across the Indo-Pacific, and by the 2000s, maritime governance specifically became a major arena for track engagement. Maritime security, domain awareness, connectivity, etc. Institutions like CSCAP, the ASEAN Regional Forum, and the NMF's own dialogues and workshops are all built upon what we now think of as a track 1.5 architecture for maritime issues. Since the 2010s, the growth of minilateral groupings and issue-based dialogues has made all of this even more prominent. I do want to draw one distinction carefully, because track 1.5 and track 2 often get lumped together. However, please note that they do function quite differently. Track 2 is primarily about the long game, idea generation, norm building, keeping strategic conversations alive over time. Its influence on policy is real, but even more indirect, through academic publications, shaping how people think on conceptual ideas, building the intellectual ground that policy eventually stands on. This usually takes years. Track 1.5 is closer to action and execution, as serving officials, policymakers, and experts all decide what gets discussed about the matter at hand. The conclusive reports and recommendations usually find their way into government processes much more directly and quickly. The case of maritime governance underscores the importance of informal mechanisms. It cuts across everything simultaneously: security, trade, environment, connectivity, disaster response, fisheries, resource management. It is natural and increasingly evident that no single institution in the Bay of Bengal covers all of these themes. What informal platforms offer is something formal institutions genuinely cannot. Flexibility, continuity, and the space to work across those sectoral boundaries without getting stuck in jurisdictional debates. Sensitive issues such as maritime boundary overlaps, fisheries tensions, or competing infrastructure investments can be discussed in these settings far more openly than in formal negotiations where every word carries sovereign weight. When it comes to trust, whether bilaterally or multilaterally, trust doesn't come from signing treaties. It comes from people sitting in rooms together repeatedly over years until steady and stable relationships are forged. This is the USP of track 1.5 mechanisms. The track ecosystem in the Bay of Bengal is quite substantial, owing to the efforts of the BIMSTEC network of policy think tanks, maritime institutions like the NMF in India, the RSIS in Singapore, the BIMSTEC in Bangladesh, and the Pathfinder Foundation in Sri Lanka. Strategic dialogues such as the Raisena Dialogue, the Gaul Dialogue, the Indo-Pacific Regional Dialogue, to name a few, also contribute to the Track 1.5 mechanisms by encouraging participation of an ever-increasing number of countries across the Indo-Pacific, while developing more conversation on relevant topics of cooperation and sensitivities, no matter how uncomfortable they may be.